Welcome to Talkless Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Bottler, and I'm your host for Talkless Water. I'm also the principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, which you can find at waterdisputes.org. In addition, I'm editor-in-chief of Texas Plus Water and the Texas Water Journal. Both publications are free. My guest today is Emily Lewis, a shareholder and a co-chair of the Natural Resources Practice Group with Clyde Snow in Salt Lake City, Utah. Emily is also the host of the Ripple Effect podcast and an adjunct professor of law at the University of Utah. Emily, welcome back to Talk Plus Water.
Hey, Todd. I'm very happy to be here with you.
Well, it's great to have you back. And you were very kind to have me on your show recently. And I'm looking forward to seeing you release that maybe at the beginning of the year. And let's get in some talk about water here right before Thanksgiving.
All right.
So in previous episodes, you told us how you decide on a career related to water. I'd like to know today, what gets you up out of bed every weekday to work on water issues?
Great question, Todd. First of all, I'm very excited to be back, very honored to be on this podcast, Talk Plus Water. It's a great resource. And so I really appreciate your time and efforts here to get out the water conversation into the community, because I think it's incredibly important and continues to be a hot topic, regardless of what's happening these days. So, yeah. What gets me out of bed every day regarding water issues? So I think I mentioned probably in our previous podcast, I'm a water attorney. I do, private water law. My clients range from individuals to developers to municipalities, and increasingly so into kind of special projects, kind of policy issues, markets, kind of putting the big picture pieces together. And so I feel incredibly fortunate to have a position where I really get to see a lot of different issues from a lot of different perspectives. And I think that's very, very helpful. And I feel pretty fortunate from that perspective. What gets me out of bed every day, I'm kind of mid-career. I'm about 15 years into my legal career, which is kind of a fun space to be in, because you're learning every day, but you feel like you've got a good runway of experience to work from. Is that it's ever changing. We could talk, 6 months from now, and the topics will be kind of similar but different. I feel like it's always an incredibly challenging field to be working in, but also just so rewarding. And I think especially over the last 5 or so years, especially here in the state of Utah where I practice, where we've had a couple pretty big water, topics, matters, and we're going to talk about that here today, really dictate a lot of the conversation. I think what gets me out of bed is that it's just fun. I just really like everybody we work with. I think everyone is really solution oriented. And every day I just am really impressed with the creativity of the water community and, the honest and earnest, drive to kind of make practical solutions for water here in the state. And so at the end of the day, it's just fun. I like it.
I love your answer. I completely agree with you. The water community is a really interesting tribe. And I remember when I started out in the late 80s, it was not nearly as interesting, and it wasn't very diverse. And, the kinds of solutions we had for water problems weren't really very diverse. There were kind of a limited number of things that people did. And it's so different now. And the people involved are so different. And it's really a can-do community in many ways, even though, there are some really difficult, almost seemingly intractable problems that have to be dealt with. What I'm encouraged about is it always does seem like there are alternatives, and that a lot of times those alternatives are ones that, you might not have really thought were potential alternatives. I love that. Yes. So one of the things that really qualifies for an intractable issue is out there in the West, and it has to do with the Colorado River. And of course, the Colorado River was, constantly in the headlines during the height of the drought, the mega drought. Now that that is seemingly over with, uh, you know, headlines have died down, but a lot of important things are going on. Can you kind of give us an update on what's going on out there? For example, the decisions that are being negotiated right now about the future of the Colorado River.
Yeah. And again, I'm here in my personal capacity. I don't speak for anybody. We do have some clients with Colorado River interests, and I do some work for the Colorado River Water Authority of Utah and Central Utah Water Conservancy District. So, the caveats that I am not here on their behalf, but just as a maybe a general update for those who may be outside of the West on the Colorado River. The Colorado River is incredibly important. It provides water to 40 million people. It's really the big artery of water here in the Western United States, and is managed under a very, very complex set of laws that we call the Law of the River. Everybody really focuses on the Colorado River Compact that was negotiated in 1922, under conditions that, may not be actually reflective of the hydrology of the river, of the basin. And so, we're kind of starting from this place of, paper water and wet water discrepancies just from the very beginning. And so I think in more recent terms, and times, we had a pretty severe drought here in 2020, 2021 that really brought to light that we've had decades of kind of deficits in our reservoirs, and that there are some pretty severe and declining reservoir levels in Lake Powell and Lake Mead. The issues with that is that, has a big ripple effect and trickle down effect on kind of, delivery obligations between the upper basin and lower basin. With Lake Mead, we started to run into, and Lake Powell, issues of dead pool. When reservoirs get too low, they don't produce power. This power production is reduced, which then therefore reduce revenue for some of our Colorado River, conservation programs. I mean, those low reservoir levels really have a pretty large impact on a number of issues. And so, for several years, we were pretty focused on some kind of emergency interim management and negotiations. DROA was one of them. But now that we are starting to see, we're really fortunate to have a pretty banner water year in 2022, 2023. In fact, it was the biggest water year that Utah's ever seen. We were 200% of normal in our precipitation, which, just to take a quick note about that, I think that is one thing that really highlights to me the fact that regardless of what field of water you're working in, the norms are not dependable anymore. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot of these really big swings between drought and plenty. And so adapting our management techniques and our thinking and our adaptability, our resiliency to these kind of highs and lows, I think is just critical. And I think that the Colorado River in the last 5-ish years is really exemplary of that, of, the hydrology can change pretty quickly. And in addition to that, we're having some long-term changes in terms of, the amount of water evaporating out of the Colorado River too. So kind of these, long-term climatic changes that we have to take into account, but also just inter-year variability is something that we're going to be dealing with. But just from, a quick overview of kind of where we are, I think most of the energy right now in the Colorado River is working for our 2026 operational guidelines. And so the current operating guidelines kind of between how the reservoirs between, upper basin, lower basin are managed are set to expire. And so right now we are working and trying to figure out what those 2026 guidelines will look like. We've had a number of competing proposals from, upper basin states have kind of gotten together and created a proposal. Arizona created a proposal, BOR had a proposal, and then a consortium of environmental groups and academics also had a proposal. And so right now, I think most of the energy in the room is looking at kind of what these 2026 guidelines might be. They finished an environmental assessment on several of them. And so I think kind of that's what people are mostly talking about. And for those who are less familiar with the Colorado River, that doesn't mean we're renegotiating the 2022 compact. It doesn't mean, or the 22 compact. It doesn't mean we're looking at how we're reallocating water between states. This is really kind of like operational management between reservoirs and kind of what we do and whether or not we can do things like demand management programs or, how we can maybe do accounting for credits of water in reservoirs. And so, these are really, really important negotiations and discussions. But they're also we're not redoing the Colorado River. We're, working inside the existing system.
So you've got competing, recommendations about what those guidelines would look like. How different are they when you kind of look at the range of what's been proposed by the various groups? Are they, really fundamentally different? Or are the differences, relatively minor? I mean, and by minor, I don't mean unimportant, but certainly, to the average person, that might not be something that might, jump off the page.
I mean, I think that these, and again, I'm not talking on behalf of anybody, and I dabble in some Colorado River work on behalf of clients occasionally, but most of my work is on very specific, discrete projects. I am by no means at the table having these discussions.
No one else is listening to this podcast. I think you and I are the only ones who will hear it. So just say whatever you want.
So there's a bunch of them, and I think I think that what the difference is there's a couple, honestly, for those who are very interested in it. I think if you want to do a deep dive, there's a couple of really good resources that would be, a good place for you to go outside me. Utah State University actually has a really good Colorado River Studies program that is a lot of summaries of these things. And so, there's a lot of good resources out there about the specific individual programs. But again, it kind of comes down to kind of what are obligations between states, what are obligations between, the two different reservoirs like Powell and Lake Mead. What do we include in terms of our operational guidelines? Where does conservation fit in? I think the big issue here is, the upper basin has an obligation to deliver a certain amount of water to the lower basin on kind of a 10-year rolling average. And the questions that we're looking at is, kind of demand side and supply side. If the upper basin is able to do conservation measures and, kind of reduce demand so that it can have credits in the lower, credits in a reservoir, how does that work in terms of our delivery obligations? I think that's kind of the main issue right now is how does conservation and kind of, water management from a demand side really fit into these operations between the states? And, is it a wet water exchange? Is it a credit exchange? How do we really make sure that we're making guidelines that make sense for the conditions we find ourselves in? We're in a different kind of climactic era, we're in a different political environment. And, we really want to make sure that there's flexibility to meet these very complicated and very politically important obligations between the states.
So thinking about all that, I'm curious, when you talk about the upper basin versus the lower basin states, in addition to maybe conservation measures that the lower basin states, I guess, would like to see the upper basin states put in place, or maybe provide some incentives for them to do that? Is there also any effort to maybe help fund any rehabilitation of watersheds in the upper basin states to provide more water, anything like that?
I think that between both upper and lower basin, all those kind of solutions are really actively being discussed right now. I think that Bonneville Environmental Foundation and a bunch of groups had a really interesting state public-private partnership with some tribes, kind of doing large-scale conservation projects that had some watershed and some large-scale, conservation programs implemented last year. I think that I think that the reality is that we're understanding that water management is a lot more than bean counting. And so making space for those more interesting, collaborative, and creative projects that could dip into watershed management, dip into agricultural efficiency projects, I think really are part of these discussions. And the question is, how do you turn paper theory into wet water, deliverables? And I think that's kind of the question out there.
There's definitely an issue with accounting in terms of, what those programs produce in terms of acre feet. And so that's something we, had a lot of discussions about that concerning the Edwards Aquifer and the contributing and recharge zone a couple of decades ago. And, the stumbling point was generally, well, what does that mean in terms of crediting, one entity with additional, rights that they can pump out, or expanding their rights that they can pump out because they put money into a watershed rehabilitation program that is supposed to produce, a certain amount of additional recharge maybe. And so, it gets complicated for sure, figuring that out.
Yeah. And again, I'm probably not, we could have a whole discussion about Colorado River management, things that are happening here in the next couple of years. And I may not be the best folks, but I can just tell you from an outside perspective, I do think that there are a lot of people who are at the table who are earnestly trying to work on these problems. There's hundreds of thousands of man hours, going on right now. And so I do think that it's an interesting time to be watching what's happening because, kind of like we mentioned earlier, right now is kind of the time for creativity. I think there's a lot of things that are on the table that, we hadn't even thought about, in 2007, when the last guidelines, that are more of a reality now. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of programs come up from these discussions, what kind of programs get legs, and then kind of ultimately what we decide are going to be the ultimate operating guidelines.
So I think it was sometime maybe around 2020, there was a new proposal by Utah to tap the Colorado River in a new project. I'm not sure I have those years right, but it seemed like something had come up recently. And so I'm curious if you can give us an update on that.
Yeah. And again, I'm not speaking for anybody. This is just an outside perspective. Yeah. So the Lake Powell Pipeline is a project that the state of Utah has put, public funding behind and public, resources to try and look at as a water source for our growing regions in southern Utah. And so this was a pipeline to pump some water from Lake Powell to the St. George area in Washington County, which is one of the fastest growing areas in the state, but also one of the fastest growing areas in the West. I think that this is another interesting kind of case study in water management in a changing era, because we've put a lot of money into the Lake Powell Pipeline for quite some time in terms of doing the EIS, doing all the environmental studies. And then I think the practical reality of the 2021 and 2022 drought really kind of has put that project a little bit on hold to kind of see, what is the reality of this, given that we may not produce the wet water numbers that, we had anticipated when this project started being in planning. It's still an active project. The state hasn't by any means, stepped off of that. But I think right now, from my understanding at the last presentation I saw on it, all the environmental work has been mostly done, but now there's some questions about, economic feasibility and actual kind of wet water feasibility, given the numbers we have. That being said, I think the state of Utah is actively committed to developing their Colorado River water resources, and this is one option on the table to do so.
So that option would take water to southern Utah, but it wouldn't take it. That doesn't include Salt Lake. Or does it?
No. So right now, the way that Colorado River works in Utah is that, the Central Utah Project is a project that was funded in the 1950s through the Bureau of Reclamation. It's a BOR project, very similar to the, Central Arizona Project, a couple large scale water projects here in the West. And so The Central Utah project is a multi-unit project with several large reservoirs that is a trans-basin diversion project that brings Colorado River watershed water over to the Wasatch Front for both municipal and agricultural uses. Central Utah Water Conservancy District, which is a client of our firm. And again, I'm not speaking on behalf of Central Utah, just kind of giving some basic overviews, is the governmental entity that is charged with distributing that water through repayment contracts. And so we already receive a large amount of water from the Colorado River Basin here on the Wasatch Front. I think we deliver to 1.5 million people. We have an incredibly huge service area. We have a lot of contracts for agricultural use in the state as well. And so we're already through the CUP using a large amount of our Colorado River water here on the Wasatch Front, which is interesting because that ties into the Great Salt Lake, because the Great Salt Lake is on the Wasatch Front. And so one of the things I think that, an outside observer might not initially see here in Utah is that we're just kind of one big plumbed state. And so if you pull a thread on one side of the state, it affects things on the other side of the state. And so water management here in Utah in particular is particularly nuanced.
Well, since you brought it up, let's go ahead and go on to the Great Salt Lake. I guess the post-drought period has seen some recovery in the level of the lake. And so I'm interested in hearing about that, but also, have measures that have been taken to help avoid the low levels in the future? Have they made an impact? Are there new measures coming? Any thoughts, after a few years about how those measures will work?
Yeah. And I feel a little bit more, on point talking about Great Salt Lake Matters, but I deal more directly with Great Salt Lake Matters than I do with Colorado River. So again, Colorado River stuff, there's fantastic resources out there. I highly recommend, if you want more Colorado River Matters or more information, go seek out them from, Colorado River Studies or BOR. There's a lot of great stuff already out there. So don't have me be that person. In terms of Great Salt Lake, we do a lot of active and direct work on the Great Salt Lake. So similar to drought concerns on the Colorado River, in 2021, we saw the Great Salt Lake drop to its absolute lowest value ever. The last time we got any kind of where close was in the 1950s and 60s in terms of recorded lake levels. And so the Great Salt Lake, for those who are not familiar, is a water body of hemispheric importance. It is a flyaway for birds. It's a huge, huge environmentally. It's really, really important, especially as saline lake systems across the West dry up. It's kind of becoming like the last vestige of kind of these saline lake systems and these flyaway systems for these migratory birds. It's also incredibly important because it is a huge part of the water system here along the Wasatch Front. If you come out to Utah and you come out for that, Utah snow for powder, that's lake effect snow. And so we get these big storms coming in from the Pacific. They get stuck on the Wasatch Front. They collect water off the Great Salt Lake, then they dump it on the mountains. And so when we have a reduced Great Salt Lake, it also has this cyclical effect of reducing the amount of snow we receive, which therefore reduces the amount of water we get here in terms of our culinary supply. I think like somewhere in the low 90%, 92% of our water supply here along the Wasatch Front is surface water from our canyons. So it's a really, really large percentage of our culinary water supply for certain areas. We also get water from the CUP, like I talked about earlier, and there is some groundwater, but mostly it's surface water. And so to respond to this really dire situation in early 2022, 21-22, in the couple years preceding that, the Utah legislature has really taken up the task of addressing our water laws to make them more flexible to bringing water to the lake. And a lot of this work actually predates the drought. For example, our law office was involved in a study that we did in 2022 which was funded by the Utah Lake Advisory Council, looking at legal strategies to bring water to the Great Salt Lake. Like, how would we change our laws to bring water to the lake? Similarly, that same year, a legislative funded activity called HRC 10 did a similar study. And it was pretty fun to see how we hit on a lot of the same things, which is great, because I think when you've got kind of like a big beta testing something, it works out great. And so what's been really fun to see is that I think Utah has seen the benefits of investing in planning documents so that we're acting strategically and we're not just kind of like scattershotting things. And a lot of those recommendations that we made in the late 2010s or 20-teens, what is that? I don't know what you call that. Thing is, yes, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020 have really come to fruition. And so we actually did for the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan, which is a legislatively funded effort to get an integrated plan for the Great Salt Lake going. Our office did a water law policy assessment and review of all the laws we've changed in the last 5 years. And it's honestly staggering. It's in like 70. We've changed like 70 water laws to 70 laws to adapt our water law to get water, ostensibly to the lake, but to modernize our water law. Give you a couple examples of that. Texas, you guys have appropriative rights and then correlative rights, right, Todd?
We have correlative rights in the Rio Grande, the middle and lower section of the Rio Grande, but the rest is appropriate.
Yeah. So we also practice the prior appropriation doctrine, and listeners to your podcast probably understand the basics. Priority date rules. You get all of your water before the next person in line gets any of theirs. Use it or lose it. If you don't use your water, we're going to return it to the public because you haven't fulfilled your social contract. And so, and then the other thing too is, when water law was initially developed, it was very heavily based on consumptive uses, irrigation, domestic, those kind of things. Those are not the needs we have today. And so in the last 5 or so years, we've made a bunch of changes to incentivize conservation. We've done a bunch of changes to do, a number of things. But I think some of the big things we've done to really move kind of like the bricks in the water law house is we've changed kind of the use it or lose it concept. So prior, there was no incentive for someone to use less water because they would use their water rights. And so we've now created a whole new system of what we call saved water. And so if you can show that you are reducing your historic depletions by installing a new, LIPA system or a LISA system or lining your canal, you can now have that depletion savings recognized as a new water right. And so you can have that actually be marketed, transferred, and used as a different water right. So we've kind of, we've changed the incentive structure about how we feel about water use to incentivize conservation. We've kind of done a suite of things that all work together. So we've got saved water that kind of gets at our water use. We have also created in-stream flow laws. So now we have one of the most expansive in-stream flow laws in the state or in the West. Before, it was incredibly restrictive. But now if you get the sign off of, an agency that has an in-stream flow mandate, like the Colorado River Authority of Utah or Forestry Fire State Lands that manages the bed of the Great Salt Lake, you can apply to have a water right changed to an in-stream flow use to be stored in a lake or reservoir, which is the Great Salt Lake, or for domain management on the Colorado River side. And then the other thing we've done is we have really invested in water markets. And so we put $40 million behind a Great Salt Lake Trust. It's called the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust to buy and lease water for Great Salt Lake purposes specifically, and also some watershed enhancement projects along the shores of the lake as well. It's not just fine water, but all those, those are kind of three big things. And then a bunch of other smaller things like, we've included water in our general planning. We've included conservation standards for all state buildings. We're, really put a ton of money into our turf buyback programs. We have done things like, really looked at our system specific sizing standards for municipalities, trying to cut down to actually what you actually need instead of using a statewide standard that wasn't based on actual use. We've made changes to our exaction laws about what we can require from developers to get it down, the water down on that perspective. So just this whole suite of, all kinds of things. And, I think we're just now kind of starting to see the benefits of all that change. I think the public has been, they see success as wet water to the lake, which is the goal. That's the goal. And that is success. But, I see success as getting the programs in place to make that a reality. And we are getting there. And so just this year, I think the Great Salt Lake Trust just announced that they have secured like 68,000 acre feet for the lake through leases and purchases and donations. And that water is actually physically getting there, because we've installed distribution systems, we've installed telemetry. I mean, the Utah legislature has put hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars into water in the last 5 years. It's pretty crazy.
Well, it sounds like you've been through a period of kind of, updating and adjusting water kind of comprehensively and maybe fundamentally in Utah as a result of, reaching this crisis situation on the Salt Lake, where I guess maybe the legislature as well as the public in Utah finally said, look, we need to revisit what we're doing and reevaluate that and make some changes. And so, like you say, once you make those changes, it takes a few years to really start seeing the impact of it. All that has to take place in terms of like the state agencies, developing and implementing, new regulations and guidelines, that takes effort. And
people.
Right. It's kind of boring and not interesting to a lot of folks, but it's fundamental. So in terms of the actual, kind of, I guess, status of the Great Salt Lake now, do you have like a benchmark in terms of the elevation of the lake that people are familiar with? And, what would you say it is now compared to where it was and, a few years ago and where it's been historically?
Yeah. And that's a great question, actually, Todd. And so I think that we've gotten a lot of public attention on the Great Salt Lake most recently because of the drought conditions. But there have been groups working on the Great Salt Lake for decades. I think Friends of Great Salt Lake is a wonderful example. The Great Salt Lake Advisory Council is another great example. Forestry Fire State Lands, a state agency that has the comprehensive management planning obligations for the lake. People have been working on the lake for decades, and so what's really fun to see is that some of those activities and investments we made in the past we're now understanding the utility of that. And for example, a couple of years ago, even before the lake hit its crisis points, they created a Great Salt Lake level matrix that basically has kind of this huge grid that shows, here's, at this level, this is optimal for this use. At this level, this is optimal for this use. When it gets to this level, we start kind of getting into issues with, salinity. At this level, we kind of start getting into issues with, microbialites, and so it's not just one level, it's a matrix of levels. And the other thing I think is really important to understand about the Great Salt Lake is that it's huge. It's a massive, massive lake. Like I want to say it's got like the biggest surface area outside the Great Salt Lake or outside the Great Lakes in the Midwest. And so it's shallow. It's only like 8 feet deep in a lot of places. So evaporation is a huge concern about the lake. And so a lot of what we do, I fully believe that the state of Utah and its water community are working to the utmost of their abilities in dedicated to getting water to the lake. But a lot of what we're going to do is going to just be dependent on hydrology. Like if we get another couple years of really high drought and really hot summers where evaporation is a big issue, that's going to affect lake levels regardless of what we do on the demand side. And so I think one of the interesting lessons of the last couple of years has been, there's no silver bullet for the Great Salt Lake. There's no lever that we can pull that's just going to bring water to the lake. It's interesting because we've had people say, well, we've got all these reservoirs. Why don't we just open the reservoirs? And it's like, well, if you want to drink next year, we can't do that. And so it's a balancing of concerns. One of the legal changes we made was we created the Office of the Great Salt Lake Commissioner, who is actually kind of a pseudo cabinet member. So they're not part of any agency. The commissioner reports to the president of the Senate, the speaker of the House, and the governor. And they have implemented recently a strategic plan. And that strategic plan has kind of 1 year, 5 year, and 30-year planning goals. And so a lot of what we're also trying to do is kind of shift the public discourse and the thinking into really sincere long-term management. And so really thinking of the lake as much more of a bank account. We're going to try and always get a trickle in every year through these leases, trickle or some amount, to, bolster lake levels. But also, like I said earlier, with, the variability of hydrology, when we have those big years, having spill agreements with reservoirs already in place so that we can just spill the water right to the lake, ahead of time. And so kind of these more flexible and adaptive tools being in place now so that when the water is there, we can take advantage of it. Also looking at a lot about groundwater, how groundwater affects the lake. It is the bottom of a basin, next to the Wasatch Mountains. And so, studying groundwater, it's been pretty interesting. If anyone wants to know more about it, I would definitely go to the Great Salt Lake website. The state of Utah has invested a ton of money in education, and they've got a fantastic Great Salt Lake website that kind of talks about all these activities. The Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan is there. Our water law assessment is there. But that's another really good resource to kind of follow Great Salt Lake activities.
So, you're talking about the things that have happened over the last couple of years. I think last time you were a guest on this podcast was spring of 22, and we were talking about Utah's efforts to encourage water banking and water markets. And so can you give us an update on what has happened with water banking and water markets since 2022?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was fortunate to act as the Utah Water Banking Program Manager for about 4 years. And so this was an awesome project. It was just so fun. It was such a good project. So basically, the history of this project, and I think we probably talked about this a little bit in our prior conversation, but in about 2017, 2018, Utah, I want to take one step back for a second. So one thing I think is interesting about Utah is that I think that due to its history of being a Western state, it's a pioneer state, outside and acknowledging that there were native peoples here forever, and that their knowledge is incredibly important and needs to be recognized and taken into account in water management. But, in terms of Western kind of white settlement, Utah is a pioneer state. Like we came here with traditionally, literally like Mormon wagon trains and, and mining. And so water has been part of the planning, water planning has been part of the DNA for Utah for a really long time. And, I think we've kind of hit our growth spurt about 20 years after Colorado and about after Vegas. So we're dealing with kind of new issues to us that are a little bit more critical now that we have a huge population and now we've got climate change. But I think we've been planning for water. We're pretty active in our water planning. And so as part of that kind of practice in 2018, we had a couple strings of thought about, kind of what is the next step we have for water. We created this big, governor's executive water. We did the governor's water strategy report that kind of laid out, ways we can think more savvy about water. And, we had a couple other threads of conversation that all hit upon this concept of water banking, quote unquote, as a means of, using our existing prior appropriation system and market tools as a way to, kind of reallocate or, move water between water users. And so from that, we built a new statute, the water banking statute, which basically is a way to recognize certain kinds of water leasing arrangements and then giving them certain, allowing them to be approved as water banks. And then we would extend to them kind of certain privileges that were requested by water users, like forfeiture protections, streamlined, change application proceedings, et cetera. And then to kind of test those principles, we received about $800,000 in funding from the BOR's Water Smart Water Marketing Grant, and then a state appropriation to basically pilot the concepts of this Water Banking Act. And so in 2022, when we last talked, Todd, we were probably right in the throes of kind of getting our pilot projects going, I would think, realistically. And so from then, it's been super fun. So basically what we've been doing is I personally think the project has been a really big success. And I say that with a quick caveat that we'll come back to. But we basically set up 4 pilot projects. We were originally only supposed to do 3. So under the Act, we have 2 different kinds of banks. We've got a contract water bank, which is basically just a contract for leasing. And then we've got a statutory water bank, which is kind of more like a middleman, like a forum, like a market, like an actual market that's intended to kind of connect people, unknown users and unknown lessees and unknown lessors. And so in creating these banks, what we did is we actually kind of distilled the common lessons that we learned from all of our discussions. And so the actual deliverable is a statewide water marketing strategies report. But it's much more than a report. It's actually a website. And so what we've done is in our conversations and setting up these pilot projects, it very clearly came to our attention that the barrier was how to order people's thinking about water markets. It gets really complicated really quickly. And Todd, because you just finished your big, water marketing report for Texas. People just don't know where to start. They're curious and they want to explore, but they don't know where to start. And so what we did is we actually distilled our lessons learned into 5 key marketing milestones, and those are, people, markets, transactions and approvals. And basically what we did is we created a step-by-step guide that's intended for you to actually print it out, like go print it out and then, take it to your irrigation company board meeting with a pen and start answering questions in order. And that's going to tell you whether or not you have the right people in the room. That's going to tell you whether or not you actually have a market in your local area. You know what I mean? Like, because what we found too is sometimes there wasn't actually a market because everybody wanted water when there was no water. So, that's not a market. That won't work. And then we have the third milestone is logistics. And so then we had specific questions about, do you have the legal approvals you need? Do you have the physicality, the ability to move the water where you want it? And then, the approvals and then the logistics. The transaction is actually, we've created a big matrix about different kinds of leasing arrangements that you look at. Do we want to do a bulletin board? Do we want to do an RFP process? Do we want to do a one-time lease? Do we want to do option contracts? So that, people could actually print out materials and kind of actually circle things, cross out things, really find a way to kind of take ownership of this process themselves. And so we have a fantastic website. I highly recommend anyone who's interested in water marketing to go there. Really user-friendly materials. It's open and there and everything's there for the public. The project has kind of concluded the pilot phase, and now we're moving into, trying to help kind of get, individual independent water banks, or water transactions. It's bigger than just banks. Our banks are just one kind of water marketing transaction you could use. Kind of up and running in the state. So long-winded, but an exciting project that I think we've really, I have a lot of thoughts about, its successes, I wouldn't say successes and then lessons learned, I would say.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, in the water market study I did, I kind of focused kind of on two categories. One is creating new water markets, where you can actually probably create them, and then how to enhance transactions outside of those markets, so that people have not only an incentive but an ability to trade water where it makes sense to do so. And so it sounds pretty similar to it sounds like essentially what y'all have done too. And I think that's the way to think about it.
Yeah, and I do want to come back to that caveat I said a few moments ago. So what I think has been interesting about this project is that it ostensibly started as, a water banking, quote unquote, project. And it still kind of gets that, is tagged as a water banking project. And I honestly don't know how many water banks in the state of Utah are actually going to be created under our act. What we found is that it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to get these set up. I do think that the act is really prescient. And I can see as some of these, drought cycles come up and some of these market forces come up that, we'll probably see more of them come up in the future. But where I think that the actual value of this project lies is that, whether or not we have a bunch of Utah water banks stamped with the Utah Water Bank mark, I don't really think I don't think that's the measure of success. I think the measure of success is that this project really got the conversation about water market going. You know what I mean? I think, but for some of these early discussions about water banking, laying the groundwork of talking about water markets and water transactions, I don't know if we would have had such an easy path to the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust. I don't know if we'd have such an easy path to some of the demand management questions we're having here on the Colorado River side. So I think the value in that project is that, it really helped people become familiar with the concepts so that they can act and adopt them in a way that makes sense for the actual conditions on the ground right now.
So thinking a bit outside of the borders of Utah to the rest of the West, are you seeing any new trends regarding the establishment of new water markets? Any new trends at all, I guess, regarding water markets?
Yeah, I think so. I think so for sure. And I think water markets, I feel like that's kind of become like the new sustainability term where it means everything and anything to anyone, like.
By the way, you're absolutely right about that. And, when I go through, in my report, I went through the various definitions I found of water markets, and it was, it's an omni-gatherum. Essentially.
Yeah.
This must be a water market, right? Because somebody is selling something to somebody, or leasing something to somebody. Not necessarily, but sorry, to interrupt.
No, I'm with you. Please. Yeah. I'm a talking head, Todd. I will talk all the time. You need to interrupt me. No, I think what I'm seeing West-wide, and one of the wonderful things, I feel very fortunate that, like Todd, I host a water podcast called Ripple Effect. And the wonderful thing about that is you get to talk to people all the time from all over the place and what they're doing, And so I think the concepts of water marketing and using market principles to address water problems is increasing, and it should, because that's I'm a firm believer in the prior appropriation doctrine. I think there are interesting academic theories out there like rights of nature, public trust doctrine, all these kind of things that are cool to talk about when it comes to water management. But the reality is we're short on time. And the prior appropriation doctrine actually is incredibly flexible and stable. So in my mind, we need to work inside that system to meet new demands. And so West-wide, I think people are really starting to look at that. I think there's some really interesting things happening with like corporate water stewardship. I think corporations are moving away from this concept of using, carbon markets as a simile for water markets. Oh, I'm going to have 1 liter of reductions, just like you'd have 1 liter of CO2 reductions. Like that's not really how it works for water. Water is so specific to the location. It's not just like a global pool of water in the sky that's transferable or fungible. And so you're seeing corporations understanding that, oh, maybe our best and highest use is just giving money to people who've got projects on the ground, and having watershed improvements, like you said. I had a really great podcast a couple months ago with Verity. I'll find it here in 2 seconds. But they are doing this super interesting way to basically promote watershed improvement projects to reduce watershed improvement projects to improve water quality that would therefore reduce the need for the construction of new water treatment plants. And water treatment plants are incredibly energy intensive. And so then what they're doing then is they're selling the reduced carbon credits that, basically deferred carbon credits that would have, but for not building this treatment plant, you wouldn't have had all these carbon emissions, and then basically using the deferred carbon credits as a way to play in the carbon market. So these super interesting ways of saying, well, we're going to, instead of building this water treatment plant, we're going to use a watershed improvement facility and then get credit for those efforts on a different kind of market. And so I am seeing lots of interesting things happening in terms of just kind of like breaking the reins off what we think of as water. You know what I mean? It's not a specific per drop, exchange, but kind of more of these integrated collaborative processes to address water problems.
Yeah. Interesting. There's a whole category of ecosystems out there that do all that for free called wetlands that we have kind of decided we're not going to prioritize protecting them anymore. But yep. Now I'm with you on that. So we're getting towards the end here, and I want to ask you about something that might be a bit of a touchy thing. So every state kind of in the West, I think, has kind of its reputation in terms of how it does in terms of managing its water, and whether it's really kind of, on the leading edge of being innovative, or is really kind of being drug along because, it doesn't have a whole lot of choice in the matter. And so I'm wondering what you think Utah's reputation is, because as you and I have discussed in the past, we've seen some, every once in a while there's maybe an article about how Utah is doing. And so, here's your chance to set the record straight. Okay.
I love it. And just real quickly, it's Verity, VIRRIDY, is doing this kind of interesting watershed enhancement credits for kind of carbon market exchanges. So really interesting project. Yeah, I think that's a great question, Todd. And I think it's a good one to have. And I think it's a good one to ask about any state, because I think that, in our introductory comments, what's so exciting about water is that things constantly change. And so, I think Utah has been, in the past, like I said, I think internally and inside the state, we've always understood water and water planning, and it's always been a priority, but that probably hasn't been as big of an issue for like interstate issues until kind of more the recent 10 years or so with drought and climate growth here, or climate change and then population growth. But I think that we have really taken the challenge head on. And I said this before in several podcasts too, but I think Utah really is the sweet spot, because we're big enough to have a lot of sophisticated players, people who are really good at their jobs, who really understand water, who are, committed to finding creative solutions, but we're small enough to get stuff done. We're not like California, where you have like a bunch of bureaucratic circles to jump through before you get anything done. And so I think Utah in the last 5 or 6 years has really done a lot of fascinating things. I think we've spent a ton of money in models. We've got a new model called UCRAF, which is kind of, modeling out our Colorado River water resources. We spent a ton of money on things like, airborne snow observatories to try and figure out, our water supplies and forecasting. We've hired a bunch of new people for our water agencies, kind of putting our money where our mouth is for putting people on the ground. And so I think, not slowly but surely, but actually quite quickly, I think the reputation of Utah in the water world has changed. You go to these interstate conferences and, I think people really are starting to look to the state as a leader, both in technology and policy and, creative solutions, but also really pragmatic. I mean, one thing I love about working in water, especially in today's day and age, is that it's kind of politically neutral. We all care about getting to the right solution. And I think we've really had a lot of wonderful examples of reaching across the aisle to come to some pretty creative solutions for some pretty hard problems. And I think Utah really is, a leader in this field and deservedly so. And so it's an exciting time to be here. There's lots of issues. There's lots of fun things. I mean, fun is a relative term. But I think we should be proud. And I think that, we shouldn't rest on our laurels. There's a lot of really hard work yet to be done, but I think we've really risen to the challenge, and there's a lot of cool things that we've been doing that, deserve to be talked about and, interpreted and tested other places. And, we're always learning from our sister states as well. But I think we're putting ourselves in a good position.
That's great. That's great. So, Emily, final question for you today. How can our listeners find out more about your work and also about the Ripple Effect podcast?
Yeah, certainly. So, like I said earlier, I'm a lawyer at the law firm of Clyde Snow and Sessions up here in the state of Utah. We've got a really active water section in our firm. We do, all kinds of regular work, due diligence, but we also do, creative projects, water markets, water policy projects, kind of creative thinking. So, website, that's a great place. Ripple Effect is on iTunes, Spotify, all the regular places you find, your podcasts. And I promise there's less of me on those and more of the other people talking. Being on the other side of the microphone is a little interesting.
I don't know. They're probably, you did so well. You should maybe do more talking on your podcast.
Yeah. Well, this is so much fun stuff happening and so many good folks out there working right now. But yeah, I mean, honestly, the way I approach things right now in my career, in my life, is that it's just a big conversation right now. And so, email me if you've got questions or thoughts. Todd and I don't know, Todd, we probably talk every 6 weeks or something on something just randomly,
Seems like it,
yeah. Yeah. And that's what I love about it is like, I got a question about this or a question about X, Y, and Z. And so, I just see myself as kind of, one member in that dialogue right now. And there's just a lot of fun, cool stuff happening.
Agreed. Well, hey, I always enjoy talking with you, and you did a great job today. Thanks, again for being on my podcast.
Yeah. Hope to come back. Reach out. I love it.
Oh, well, definitely. You have become a regular now. So you're one of about, I guess, 5 people now who are regulars, and people keep downloading the episodes with the regulars. So I think, the listeners must like that. So that's always good news. So this has been Talk Plus Water. My guest today was Emily Lewis, a shareholder and co-chair of the Natural Resource Practice Group of Clyde Snow in Salt Lake City, Utah. Emily is the host also of the Ripple Effect podcast and an adjunct professor of law at the University of Utah. I want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. And I also want to give a big thank you to Anna Huff at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting every episode of Talk Plus Water ready to go. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, you might think about leaving a review or doing something like that, because we'd like to know that you're out there listening. And other than that, everybody have wonderful holidays. And my name again is Todd Vodler. Let's talk water again soon.